Hello, welcome to my studio. Today we are painting these beautiful pink tulips. For the paper today, I'm using my 5" by 7.5" watercolor sketchbook. It's 100% cotton paper. And for the brush, I'm using a size 6 round brush. The first step is to trace in 3 ovals. Each tulip starts with an oval form, and then a straight line down or slightly curved line down for the stem. Kind of elongated S shapes or curvier lines for the leaves. I give each tulip 2 leaves. For the flower on the right hand side, I'm making the oval into a pointier shape, as that will be the least bloom or more of a bud shape of a tulip. Using the kneaded eraser, I'm lightening my lines so that they are barely visible, as once you paint on top of pencil lines, you can no longer erase them. Next, I'm making a wash out of the cadmium yellow light with a few brushfuls of the water and a bit of the yellow. Mix it up really well. And then you'll want to cover the entire surface of that oval, filling it all in, so that it's nice and wet and you can see a glisten on top of the paper. You don't want it to be just damp, you want it to be pretty wet, not quite a puddle, but pretty wet so that you see that shine on top of the paper. Once you're finished filling in each of the ovals with the yellow wash, you'll want to dry it completely so that it is bone dry. Maybe use a hairdryer. And then I'm making a wash with the Madder Rose, which I think makes a really pretty pink. About 5 to 8 brushfuls of water, and then add in as much of the red or pink that you want to use, and just test it on a scrap piece of paper to make sure that it is as dark or as light as you're hoping for. You just want to make sure that it's a pretty thin wash so that you can see some of that yellow glowing through it, and so you can see the white of the paper glowing through it as well. The shape of the petal is kind of like a slightly elongated oval with a little wiggle to it. You can make the petal look differently. Some tulips have a bit of a point on the top, some have a little M shape on the top. That's up to you. And then while that petal shape is still wet, completely wet, I'm dabbing in some of that Madder Rose straight from the pan, from the palette that has not been made into a wash. And that gives you that wet on wet, kind of like a cloud-like effect as it dries. And then for the next petal, I'm using that same wash of the Madder Rose and the water, and making that kind of squished oval shape with a bit of a pointier top and a bit of a curve on the bottom, and then dabbing in the Madder Red straight from the pan towards the bottom of the petal, and then going kind of up the center of the petal and making sure to dab some at the very bottom as well. For the next tulip, it's the tulip bud that's not quite as in bloom as the other 2 tulips. So we are making much smaller petals for this one. And it's an elongated S shape in the center, and then just following the line of that yellow bud form or oval with a pointy top. So you're not going outside of the yellow at all, you're just staying right on top of the form that you've already made, that little oval with the pointy top. And then we're going right into the palette and getting some of that darker Madder Rose and dabbing that in along just the left-hand side of the petal down to the bottom, and then back up from the bottom to make that darker area on the bottom of the petal as well. While waiting for the first petals to dry, we'll go on to the third tulip, and this petal will look similar to the one that we've just done, but it's a little bit more open. So we're starting with that same Madder Rose Wash. And starting towards the top, I'm going to be making another kind of elongated S shape where it curves around and then down towards the base of the oval. And then I'm following that same curve of the oval with just the very tip of the petal at the top being further away from the outline of the oval, and then it curves closer and closer until it hits the outline of the oval, and then making sure to fill in the entire petal with the wash. And then just like we did before with the other petals, going in straight to that pan of paint and getting some of that Madder Rose on the brush and then tapping that in. So tapping it in along the left hand edge of the petal and then up kind of the center back. I'm adding more of the color for this one as I want it to be a bit darker pink than the last one that we just did. I decided I've overdone it just a little bit, so I'm taking a paper towel and soaking it back up, some of that color. Don't be afraid to do that. You can always, while it's still wet, take your paper towel or a dry brush and soak some of it back up. And then I'm going back into it and moving the color around a bit to create the more softer look and a bit of a lighter look to the top of the petal. You just want to make sure that the whole entire petal is the same wetness, so you want to make sure to re-wet that area that you used the paper towel to pick some of the paint back up so that it all dries at the same time and you don't have any strange water lines. This next petal is done in the same way with the same wash, and it's almost just a mirror image of the petal that you've just done, so like an elongated S shape that meets at the base of the oval with the other petal, and then again you follow that form of the oval down towards the base and then fill it all in with the wash. And then we go back into that Madder Rose and dab in that darker color down at the very base of the petal, and then go up the left hand side of the petal, just dabbing in that color. And then a little extra of that straight color from the pan. And then I rinse out my brush and add some of that wash, the lighter color. And I'm adding that to the petal as well to give it a more gentle transition from the darker straight color right from the pan to the lighter color of the petal. Now we're going back to the center tulip, and we're going to be making two little petal shapes so it will look like an M on the top of the tulip. Using the wash, we're starting off so it's touching the petal on the right hand side and making an arch to touch the kind of center top of the yellow oval, and then making another arch on the other side starting from the center of the yellow oval and then touching towards the top of the petal on the right hand side. Then we're filling in both of those new shapes with the pink wash, and while those two shapes are still wet with the pink wash, we're going to tap our paintbrush into that thick, intense pan of the pink paint, and we're going to be tapping it into the pink wash, but just at the point where the bottom of those shapes, where the yellow oval and that shape touch so that it looks like there's a bit of shading, a bit of shadow in those little shapes. So it kind of looks like the sun is shining and the petal has a little bit of shading, or the two petals have a little bit of shading. Now we're going back to that tulip bud and using that same wash of Madder Rose, or whatever pink that you're using, we're going to make the petal on the left-hand side and follow along the shape of the bud. So you're not painting outside of the yellow, you're just outlining that yellow shape. And then on the inside, you're coming up and meeting the petal that you've already painted in there, just kind of touching it lightly. The two of them just meet ever so slightly where they are the widest. And it's again similar to an elongated S shape in the center, but a mirror image of the one that you've already done. And then while it's still very wet, I'm tapping in that Madder Rose to create that soft wet on wet shading effect. So it gives that nice, brighter, deeper pink towards the edge of the petal. Going back to the third tulip, we are going to be making a smaller version of that M shape that's on the center tulip. So I dab my paintbrush on the paper towel a little bit, just so that it's not quite as wet, so I have more control. And using just the very tip of the paintbrush, I'm drawing that kind of a wide M shape on the top, and then coloring it in with the wash so that the shape is filled in with the wash. I've moved my little palette out of the way as I used a hairdryer to make sure that those two little top M-shaped petals on the center tulip are dry. And once they're completely bone dry, I go into that wash and I'm just covering that yellow area that's left for that center petal. And I'm making sure I very, very carefully, with just the tip of the paintbrush, cover in all of that petal that's showing that yellow area. You want to be careful not to paint over the other petals. And once you have it completely covered, then just like the other petals, while the whole wet area, that whole petal is still wet, you want to go into the pan of your paint and then dab in some of that more thick and rich color at the very base of the tulip. And then you'll also bring it up the center as well. Depending on whether you want a softer look or a more intense look for those veins of the petals, you can go back in and soften it up a little bit, or just leave it as is to dry the way that you put it down on the paper. I do go back in with my brush. I dry it off a bit so that I'm able to go in and manipulate the color a little bit. You just want to be careful to do it while the whole petal is still wet. My petal was drying out a bit, so I'm going back in with water and just wetting down the whole petal to make sure that it does dry with a very soft wet on wet look. And then go back into the pan of paint, and I'm adding in a bit of kind of like a shadow, just going up against that line of the petal and making it a little bit darker there, so it looks like there's a bit of shading right where that petal on the right hand side meets or is overlapping the center petal, and then dabbing in more of that paint right up the center, and then at the very top of the petal, just leaving a tiny thin line of the lighter wash at the very tippy top of the petal. And that gives it more of a realistic petal look. And then as the bud on the right hand side is now completely dry, I'm going in with a wash and covering that center yellow portion, or that petal that is partially covered by the two little petals on either side of it, and making sure to cover in that whole area with the pink wash. Once that whole area is covered with the pink wash, while it's still very wet, I'm going back into that madder rose color, and then going up the center about halfway, and then also dabbing it in, dropping in that color to the base of the petal as well. I then dab off my brush a little bit to go back in and manipulate it a little bit, kind of move that color around so that it creates a more softer blending effect. Now we only have one petal left, super exciting. So you want to fill that yellow area down at the base of the tulip with the same wash that we've been using. But for this one, it will be a little bit different, because after filling that area in with the wash, we're actually going in to the pan of the deeper color and filling the entire teardrop area in, just dropping that darker color in, that madder rose in, so that the entire bottom of that petal is filled in with a darker color, so it looks like the sunshine is hitting the tulip and that area is in shadow that's underneath those the two petals that we've painted in previously. So that whole teardrop looking area, it's all going to be that dark madder rose. And now I wipe off the darker color from my paintbrush, go into that same wash, and for the top portion of this petal, you're just painting it in with the wash like we've done previously. And then on the very, very tip of this petal, you're going to be adding in that madder rose color right from the pan of color, and just onto the very, very upper edge of the petal, so it gives it a more of a natural tulip petal look, a little more interest, and just leaving it like that, letting it dry, that really nice soft wet on wet look. And then I'm bringing in just a little bit more color in between those two petals, right in between where they're almost touching. And both the bottom and the top of the petal are still wet, so it blends in nicely. Now that our tulip tops are complete, we can start on the stems and the leaves. For the stems, I'm using a combination of the emerald green and the burnt sienna. The tulip petals are completely dry, so it's not bleeding into them. And I go from the very base of the tulip all the way to the edge of the paper. After making it about as thick as I think it should be, I go into the ultramarine blue and add a little dab of it right underneath the tulip petals, and then bring it all the way down the left-hand side of the stem, so it looks like the sun is shining coming from the right-hand side, and there's a bit of a shadow on the left-hand side. This takes a little bit of practice, so it's not a necessary step. The stems look fine, just one shade of green. You don't have to add that shadow, but I find it adds a little bit of interest, and it makes the stems look a bit three-dimensional. You just want to do it while they're still wet to have a soft blending effect, or you can wait until it's completely dry and then go on top with that, like a blue-green or a blue, and add the shadow. It'll just have a more defined line, but that's also a neat look. I've done it both ways, and I really like both ways. One is more of a soft look, and the other has a more of a hard drying line. So I've done the same thing with the stem for that last tulip bud and added in the shadow the same way. And now I'm using my little pinky stand to try to help me make a more of a straight line for this very last petal, which in retrospect, it could have been a little more curved, I think, based on the angle of the tulip, but it works pretty well. And then as soon as I get it to the thickness that I want it, using that wash of emerald green and burnt sienna combo, again, I add in a little bit of the ultramarine blue right underneath the tulips, the petals, and then down the left-hand side a little bit. For the leaves, I'm using that same wash of burnt sienna and emerald green. You can make the leaves thinner or thicker than I'm making mine. They come in all different shapes and sizes. Some are thinner and more curly, and some are thicker. The ones I'm painting are pretty thick, as they are based on the tulip leaves in my front yard at the moment, which are a bit shorter and a bit thicker, with a little bit of a wave to them. I'm giving each tulip 2 leaves, but you can put in as many as you'd like. This is the first layer of color that I'm putting down. After the first layer, I am going to go back in and put in a couple more layers of color, a blue-green and then a yellow as well. So I'm not too worried about what the leaves look like at this point. I'm just filling in the shapes and giving them that green color, but I know that I'll be putting more layers on top of this color. I've sped this part up a bit, but each leaf is just first done in that same initial wash of green. And then when I put in these last couple leaves, they are layering over leaves that are pretty dry so that you can see how the leaf is darker in the areas where it is layering over something underneath it. I really like that look. Not everyone cares for it, but I like being able to see all the different layers when I'm going for a more loose look and not a realistic look. And I think this tulip painting is kind of a combination between a more realistic look and a more looser, free-flowing look. So now I am putting in another layer, and this is a combination of ultramarine blue and the green that I mixed up for the leaves. I'm just following the form and shape of the leaves and adding a bit of a stripe to it. It's a very thin glaze, so it's not something that takes away from the flowers. I wanted the leaves to be a bit more, I guess maybe etheric would be the word, a bit more light and airy, as to not take the attention away from the pink part of the flowers. So after each leaf gets a stripe or two, I go in with the ultramarine blue and add a little bit more to the shadow that is right underneath each of the pink tulips. I then go in with the hairdryer and make sure the leaves are completely dry before putting on the final touch to the painting, which is to add a glazing with that light yellow wash, the same wash that we used for the ovals at the very beginning. that we started our tulips with. So we're just going over some parts of the green, the stems, and a little bit in the leaves with a stripe or two of that light yellow wash, giving it just a warm glazing. I really like to do this. I love layering. I love glazing. It's not a necessary step, but I think it gives it that same kind of warm glow that the tulips have. Since they started with that yellow wash, it's giving the leaves that same bit of that warmth, which I think ties the two together. And I feel like it gives it a bit more of a sunlit look to the painting. If you're interested in a more detailed, more realistic look for leaves, I do have a tutorial coming out where I have a more realistic look, so I will post that in the near future. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've had a great time painting this. I hope that you get a chance to create soon and enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you next time.